Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the heightened tensions between India and Pakistan. The External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar even stated that any military action from the side of Pakistan will be met with a very firm response. The second article is related to the deporting of Rohingyas, as the Supreme Court observed that the Rohingyas who are found to be foreigners under the Foreigners Act can be deported. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will help you in your prelims and mains preparation. Now, the first article is related to the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan. In any conflict, it is important not only to win militarily, but also to win the narrative war. Once the objectives of the operation are achieved, we also need to make sure that the narrative in the international community is in the favor of India. We need to expose the links of Pakistan with terrorism. Therefore, we also held talks with our counterparts in USA, Russia, UK, Saudi Arabia, UAE once the phase 1 of Operation Sindoor was done. In the press briefing which was conducted yesterday, the Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri even observed that giving state funerals to terrorists in Pakistan seems to be an established practice there. We also highlighted that the Indian response was in response to the terrorist attacks which happened in Pahalgam. The Indian action was non-escalatory in nature. We did not target the military establishments in Pakistan. We targeted the terrorist infrastructure, the terror training camps in Pakistan and Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Therefore, we do not want to escalate. But going further, we need to ensure a minimum deterrence also so that Pakistan does not dare attack us. And we need to ensure there is no further escalation. What will be the challenges in ensuring further deterrence? We'll analyze that. This is important in GS2 under the topic India and its neighborhood relations, and in GS3 under the topic role of external state and non-state actors in creating challenges for India's internal security. Now, what is deterrence? Deterrence means ensuring that the adversary does not attack you out of the fear that it will get a disproportionate impact. The response will be disproportionately high. But there are certain challenges in ensuring deterrence with respect to an adversary like Pakistan. Pakistan is a deep state. It is in the control of the army there. The military controls and takes the calls there. Its economy is in shambles. Deterrence is easier to ensure in case we are faced with an adversary which is rational in nature. Pakistan is an irrational actor. The cost-benefit calculations that it does are not rational in nature. Therefore, the Pakistan's unpredictability will be making the deterrence even more difficult because it does not take into account the high risks that its actions may invite. It has a high risk tolerance. It has revisionist goals, plus there is the nuclear asymmetry. The two powers are nuclear powers. And Pakistan also engages in proxy wars. That makes deterrence even more difficult. Through the proxies through which it fights the war with India, it is able to escape accountability, because the plausible deniability blurs the accountability and hence deterrence becomes difficult. Also, Pakistan has the historical complicity in the jihadist activities not only in South Asia but globally itself. Likewise, the cost of deterrence makes it challenging, because the military action risks escalation. The cost is not only economic but also strategic. What if it turns into a full-blown war? And we also need to balance the retaliation with the strategic objective also that we need to achieve. On top of that, it is very difficult to prove that we have achieved deterrence, because deterrence is dependent upon not the action of the hostile neighbor but upon the inaction of the hostile neighbor. Through the inaction, we will be able to prove deterrence. Now, how has India's strategy evolved over a period of time? In the 1990s, till then we were exercising strategic restraint. Whatever costs terrorism imposed upon India, we absorbed the costs till then. But this strategy evolved over a period of time. Post 2008, especially after the Mumbai attacks, we went ahead and strived for the diplomatic and economic isolation of Pakistan in the international community. And post the Uri attack in 2016, we went for the military strikes also. We conducted the surgical strikes across the line of control, and that was a major shift from restraint towards proactive response. And in 2019, in response to Pulwama, we conducted the Balakot airstrikes. That was the first airstrike in the undisputed Pakistani territory since 1971. And what is the current approach? If we observe, we are going for calculated escalation to ensure that we are able to impose costs upon Pakistan, and we are coming up with concrete evidences implicating Pakistan. For example, the evidences shown in the press briefings also, which were conducted in the past 2 days by India. Now, what are the current shifts in the government approach in counter-terrorism policy with respect to cross-border terror? One, we are going for the risk manipulation. Earlier, we based our approach upon restraint. Now, rather, we are going for active escalation also if needed to achieve the strategic objectives, that is to target the terrorism at its root itself by targeting deep into Pakistan, not only in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Likewise, the current approach is that the political parties may face the political costs also in case they are not retaliating. For example, the retaliation has to be done against provocations, else they may be costly politically as well. Plus, the domestic politics has shown that there is a strong public support in case India even takes a hardline stance going further. But there are nuclear risks which are involved. For example, Pakistan has the nuclear rhetoric. It's going for a nuclear brinksmanship in South Asia, and its nuclear red line is pretty low. It has a low credibility. For example, it even threatens India to use nuclear in case it withdraws from the Indus Water Treaty, which has been suspended by India for the time being. Likewise, if we compare the situation from 2019 to now we are going for the conventional retaliation also in case the Pakistan military goes for any action against India. And if we look at the current scenario in Pakistan, there is a deep turmoil inside it. There is an internal turmoil, the continuous tensions between the civilian establishment and the military establishment in Pakistan, and that may influence the response from the side of Pakistan. Earlier also, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, had opposed the raising of Asim Munir to the level of Army General in Pakistan. But what happened was that the elections in Pakistan were rigged, and the Prime Minister Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister, was himself ousted from power. There are certain geopolitical factors also which are involved. For example, the USA is not as deeply involved currently. It has been disengaging a bit as the leverage that it had over Pakistan was declining, and its response currently is more muted as compared to 2019. For example, the comment from there has been that the conflict between India and Pakistan is fundamentally none of our business. Likewise, the Chinese influence has been increasing rather. For example, the China backs Pakistan's sovereignty demands. It has been deepening the military and economic ties also. For example, the investments in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. What has been the challenge for India is we need to manage the dual threats. The threats from both the northern neighbor and the western neighbor, the threats from China and Pakistan, and we need to leverage the US support also so that we are able to counter the China-Pakistan axis. Now, to ensure deterrence, India's nuclear doctrine also becomes important. India acquired the status of nuclear power before 2000 itself. Once China started conducting the nuclear tests in 1960s, the United Nations Security Council came up with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that was to ensure that there is no proliferation of the nuclear weapons outside the P5 nations, outside the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, it was discriminatory. Its aim was for the disarmament of the nuclear weapons globally except the P5 nations, and the right to peacefully use the nuclear technology was ensured. Because it was discriminatory, therefore India did not sign the NPT, and India developed nuclear weapons and conducted peaceful nuclear explosions first in 1974 and then in Pokhran 2 in 1988. As we were living in an increasingly nuclearized neighborhood and in an increasingly constraining non-proliferation environment. Therefore, it was a good decision of that time. But simultaneously, to ensure that the international community does not think that India has any malicious intentions and India is not imposed upon any sanctions by the international community, therefore we came up with the draft nuclear policy also at that time. What does it say? It says that there will be no first use, that India will not be using the nuclear weapons first against a country which has nuclear weapons, and it will not be using nuclear weapons against a country which does not have nuclear weapons. Therefore, they will be used in retaliation only, in exercise of our right under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Article 51 of the UN Charter gives the right to self-defense, the individual and collective self-defense in case any UN member is attacked upon. It seeks to ensure deterrence. The draft nuclear doctrine seeks to ensure a credible minimum deterrence, but it is not for the conventional weapons. It is against the nuclear weapons only. For example, in the conventional warfare, India did not use the nuclear weapons, for example, in Kargil, or the cross-border terrorism by Pakistan and its response by India, whether it was in 2016 or the 2019 Balakot strikes or in the 2025 recent strikes or even the Chinese territorial ingressions. Plus the nuclear arsenal for India, that has to be just the credible minimum level only. We are not in the race for the size of nuclear arsenal. We don't want a large nuclear arsenal. We just want a credible minimum deterrence, as anyway a large nuclear weapons arsenal will be costly for India's economy. Plus the draft doctrine included the national security objective, that our stated objective is to ensure a global, verifiable and non-discriminatory disarmament. That only P5 nations should not be able to possess the nuclear weapons. It should be non-discriminatory disarmament. Plus the control of the usage of nuclear weapons in India lies in the hands of the civilian authorities. That is the Nuclear Command Authority headed by the Prime Minister. Plus the retaliation that shall be done shall be massive, to ensure that the damage that shall be inflicted upon the enemy, the adversary, shall be unacceptable, to ensure that the enemy does not dare to attack us. And there shall be no use of nuclear weapons against the non-nuclear weapon states. Now there have been arguments whether we should retain this no first use policy and whether we should abolish the no first use policy. The arguments in favor of the retention of no first use policy say that by adopting this we are avoiding the provocative signals. We have two nuclear powered states across our borders, the northern neighbor and the western neighbor. Therefore, we need to ensure that we are not giving provocative signals to China especially. We do not want to indulge in any arms race, and we also seek the membership, the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. For that, the no first use policy augurs well for India, and India can project itself as a responsible power, and India's tryst with the nuclear weapons has been that of a mature and responsible power, and our projected goal is that of disarmament only, and it seeks to ensure the regional balance also in South Asia. But there are certain arguments against no first use policy also. For example, it is seen to be as an antidote to the alleged conventional inferiority, for example against China. It is alleged that we are inferior to China in the conventional warfare, then we should be using our nuclear weapons in case there is a full-blown war between India and China. And it will be restricting our military options in case the no first use policy is in place, and it is often rejected by the other nuclear states also. So what will be next? First, the nuclear no first use policy is not written in stone. This was observed by the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh also in the past. And India's period of the nuclear weapons has been a period of restraint, responsibility and maturity. We have not used them. Plus, In the current response against the Pakistani actions, that has also been that of non-escalation, but we need to ensure that our response is that of the level of deterrence. Now, the recent update regarding the conflict between India and Pakistan is that India has neutralized the air defenses of Pakistan in Lahore. This will provide us air superiority over Pakistan. Air superiority will ensure that our armed forces, the air forces, will be able to operate with a degree of impunity. The air force will be able to conduct the supply drop missions, paratroop insertions, provide tactical air support, go for bombing if needed, and it will ensure that a protective umbrella is provided for the ground forces also, and it lays the ground for deeper ground attacks into the enemy territory as well if needed. Now, how do the air defense systems work? First, they go for detection. The detection is done using the radars, which are detecting using the electromagnetic waves to identify the threats, whether the incoming threat is an aircraft, a drone, or a missile. It detects the distance, the speed, and the type of the threat also. The satellites may also aid in detecting the intercontinental ballistic missiles as well. Once it is detected, it is tracked. The tracking is done through radar, infrared, and laser sensors for continuous monitoring, and multiple threats can be handled in cluttered environments also through the integrated air defense systems. It ensures accuracy to avoid targeting the friendly forces also. Then once they are tracked, they can be intercepted also. It neutralizes the threats based upon the range, type, and the speed of the incoming threat, and it requires therefore the integrated C3 systems, that is integrated command, control, and communication systems. Now, what are the interception methods for air defense? They can be multiple. One, we can go for the interception through fighter aircrafts, for example, agile interceptors like MiG-21, Sukhoi 35, and Rafale. They can be equipped with missiles, cannons, and electronic warfare systems. Then we can employ the surface-to-air missiles known as the SAMs. They can be long-range missiles, for example S-400 that we have procured from Russia. It can target the ballistic missiles and aircraft. Then the medium-range surface-to-air missiles, for example Akash and Barak new generation missile. They are mobile and they have a range of 50 to 100 kilometers. Then there are man pads also, which are portable in nature. They are very cost effective and they can be employed for countering the drones, helicopters, etc. There is the anti-aircraft artillery as well. They can go for rapid fire, the rapid firing of the shells with shrapnel dispersal as well. This is the last ditch defense usually, and it is used against the unmanned aerial vehicles also. Then there is the electronic warfare as well. We will be able to jam the enemy radars and disrupt their missiles and drones, and that can be deployed via land or air, for example the EA-18G Growler radar. Now there is a mains practice question as well. India-Pakistan relations continue to be shaped by the enduring threat of conflict, the evolving deterrence postures, the modernization of air defense systems. Examine the impact of these factors on strategic stability in South Asia. Please try to write it. Now, the next article is related to the deporting of Rohingyas. The context behind it is the observation of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said that the Rohingyas can be deported from India in case they are found to be foreigners under the Foreigners Act. Earlier, the centre had submitted an affidavit in the Supreme Court explaining its stand regarding the refugees. So, we will discuss the concerns related to India's refugee approach, the international obligations, and a few suggestions in this regard. This will be important in GS2 under the topic India and its neighborhood relations. Now, the term refugee has been defined in the 1951 UN Convention. The UN Convention on Refugees defines refugee under Article 1 Para 2. It says that refugees are those people who have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for the reason that they belong to a particular race, a particular religion, a particular nationality, or they are a member of a particular social group, or they have a particular political opinion, and they are outside the country of their nationality and they do not want to return, or they are unable to return to the country and they are unable to avail the protection of that country. India does not have a domestic refugee law. India has not ratified the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees also. We have not ratified its 1967 protocol also. But in the case of R versus Secretary for Home Department, it was observed that for a person to be given a refugee status, there has to be evidence of real and substantial danger of persecution in the home country. Now, when we come to Rohingyas, the Rohingyas are the Muslim ethnic minority group in the Buddhist majority state of Myanmar. And as per the United Nations, they have been systematically denied citizenship in Myanmar since 1982. And Rohingya as a term, it is used by them as a means to assert the collective identity and to assert their historical ties to the region. And there they have restrictive citizenship laws. For example, there are restrictions upon the marriages, divorces, inheritance, etc. Now, what did the center's approach say? Center had filed an affidavit in the Supreme Court. It had argued that we want to give priority to our own citizens first. Our citizens must have access to the resources of India, the natural resources, and we want to prioritize our citizens before the refugees. Also, as per Article 21, Article 21 is available to the foreigners also, the right to life and personal liberty. But the right to reside and the right to settle in any part of India, that is not there for the foreigners, it is there only for the Indian citizens. Plus, the national security is of paramount importance. Hence, we want to deport the Rohingyas because it is causing the problems of illegal entry, fake IDs being generated, human trafficking, and the danger of subversion. Even the Supreme Court had observed in the Mohammad Salimullah and another versus Union of India case in 2021 that the pleas to halt the deportation of a detained Rohingya cannot be entertained, and hence the plea to halt the deportation was rejected. Also, the Rohingyas entering into India have altered the demography of certain regions as per the affidavit of the central government, particularly the states of Assam and West Bengal. And India has not ratified the protocols, including the UN Convention of 1951, the UN Refugee Convention, and its 1967 protocol. Plus, there are the statutory provisions under the Foreigners Act and Passport Act under which they can be deported. The Rohingyas are treated as illegal immigrants. And the repatriation of Rohingyas has been done since late 2018 itself by India. But there are certain concerns regarding India's approach of dealing with the refugees. There are arguments from certain sects that India does not have a standardized policy for dealing with the refugees. It is done usually on a case-to-case basis. There are even allegations that geopolitical interests are taken into account when dealing with the refugees. For example, the Sri Lankan Tamils or the refugees from Tibet, they are allegedly given preference, whereas the Rohingyas are not treated equally. For example, even in the Citizenship Amendment Act, the Rohingyas are not allowed citizenship under the Act. Likewise, it is alleged that the legal aid that is provided to the Rohingyas is not adequate. The NGOs who were working in this direction providing legal aid to the Rohingyas, it is alleged that their licenses under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act have been suspended and the funding therefore has been cut off. It is also alleged that the detention conditions, the conditions in the detention camps in which the Rohingyas are kept, that is inhumane. There are certain international obligations also, despite India not being the part of the UN Convention on Refugees, India not ratifying the 1951 Convention, but there are human rights treaties. For example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which seeks to prohibit refoulement in case there is the real danger of persecution there. And India is also part of the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. When we look at the Indian law, there also we can say that the principle of non-refoulement is implicitly contained. For example, Article 51C, which is a directive principle, seeks to ensure that the international law is respected in India also. When we look at the explicit observation of the Supreme Court in Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan in 1997, the Supreme Court had said that in case there is no domestic law in a particular sphere, then international norms apply. International norms apply in the absence of the domestic laws. Now, what can be the suggestions to deal with it? One, we can go for a domestic refugee law. Enact a law which seeks to provide a uniform treatment for the refugees, and there is a standardized approach. Plus, the judiciary's role in upholding the non-refoulement for the time being can be continued. We can put in place more humane detention centers with adequate resources, with facilities for the health, education, etc. The NGOs, the support of the civil society can be taken to ensure their rehabilitation. Also, we can collaborate with the UN. Ultimately, we need to balance the goals of ensuring that there is no human right violation, but at the same time, the national security objectives must also not be hurt. There is a mains PYQ also in this regard. How does the illegal trans-border migration pose a threat to India's security? Discuss the strategies to curb this, bringing out factors which give impetus to such migration. There is a mains practice question also. India's approach to refugees, particularly the Rohingya crisis, reflects a complex balance between national security, humanitarian concerns, and international obligations. Evaluate India's approach in this context with reference to constitutional provisions, legal framework, and global conventions. Please try to write it. Now, the next article is related to the climate taxonomy document. It's a draft document. This is important in GS3 under the topic environment, climate change. Let's look at the background first. When we look at the per capita emissions of the greenhouse gases in 2023, from India it is 2.9 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. When we look at the global average, it is 6.7. When we look at the comparisons with the advanced economies, for example, Europe, it is 6.9, Japan, it is 8.3, and USA, it is even higher at 17, and Canada more than 20. Therefore, India's emissions are lower than the global average emissions. The historical responsibility, although, lies with the developed nations. There, the emissions have peaked earlier. For example, European Union in 1970s and USA in 2000s. But India faces pressure for faster transition despite having lower emissions as compared to the global average. But despite that, we have taken up key initiatives. For example, we have gone for the energy mix diversification. We have increased the share of the non-fossil fuels in production of energy, electricity. As of February 2025, 47.4% is coming from the non-fossil fuel sources. For example, solar 21.8%, wind 10%, hydro 10%, and nuclear 1.7%. The solar energy has been promoted. For example, 55 solar parks have been sanctioned with a target of almost 40 gigawatt. Out of that, 12 gigawatt is operational now itself. When we look at offshore wind, likely viability gap funding has been provided for setting up the offshore wind projects in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. When we look at the promotion of nuclear power, again 20,000 crore has been provided by the central government for the setting up of small modular reactors, and we have a target of achieving 100 gigawatt nuclear power production by 2047. To increase the energy efficiency, the government came up with the Perform Achieve Transfer PAT scheme, which saved 26 million tons of emission. The carbon credit trading was proposed. It covers 9 sectors, for example, cement, steel, etc. The Ujala scheme went for the distribution of the LEDs, according to which 367 crore LEDs were distributed. To decarbonize the transport sector, the government came up with the scheme of FAME, gave subsidies for the electric vehicles, and now 38,000 electric buses are also planned. The Green Hydrogen Mission provides for the 5 MMT per year target by 2030 itself. Now, coming to the climate taxonomy document, what are the objectives behind it? One, we want to ensure that there are greater resource flows, to ensure that the greenhouse gas emissions, they can be brought down further. Greenwashing that is often done by the industries, that can be prevented, and it is consistent with our goal of Viksit Bharat at 2047. It will cover the technologies, measures, projects, activities for both mitigation as well as adaptation to climate change, and it will support the transition of the hard to abate sectors, especially, for example, the cement industry, iron and steel industry, etc., which are high greenhouse gas emission sectors. Now, what are the sectors which are targeted? They include the power, mobility, buildings, agriculture, food, water security, and the hard to abate sectors. What will be the principles in this regard? One, it will be in line with our stated position on climate action and the development priorities. whereby we'll be gradually but consistently bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions and the intensity of emissions. Will be doing no significant harm to other objectives of the climate finance taxonomy. Will focus on the pathways and trajectories in the country context, focusing upon the developmental goals of India, and it will be ensuring the interoperability and the consistency of the objectives. It will be to support the transitional activities as well, promoting the use of indigenous technologies and to ensure that the MSMEs who are working in this regard are also supported. Now let's also have a look at some of the sectors where it is particularly focusing and the government initiatives taken and planned. For example, the power sector, it contributes 39% of India's greenhouse gas emissions as of 2020. What are the goals for this sector? To scale the capacity to 777 gigawatt by 2030 by using a mix of the renewables, that is solar, wind, bio, as well as nuclear energy, green hydrogen, and building up storage capacity. For that, what are the initiatives taken? One, we want to utilize the ultra supercritical technology that will bring down the emissions, and simultaneously the ramping up of nuclear energy through the small modular reactors and a revised target. In the mobility sector, if you observe, it accounts for 13% of energy sector emissions in 2020. The policies of the government in this regard include FAME, ethanol blending, the introduction of the rapid transit systems, the metro systems, and the transition will include the short-term reliance on fossil fuels, but the investment in low carbon technology, for example, the EVs and hybrids, will continue. To ensure that the buildings are energy efficient, for that policies include the Energy Conservation Building Code, Eco Niwas Sanhita, Griha certifications, etc. In the agriculture and food security sector, there are challenges that India faces. For example, only 55% of land is irrigated, 85% farmers are small farmers who are vulnerable to climate shocks, and we need climate finance for ensuring agri-resilience. The solutions include investing in the research and development for ensuring climate resilient crops and precision irrigation, and private investment in the post-harvest infrastructure. For the hard to abate sectors, for example iron and steel and cement, the challenges are there are high emissions from the processes that are required in the industry, and the transition will be capital intensive. The solution proposed is to invest in low emission technology, for example carbon capture, and to avoid stranded assets in the sector, and to include more sectors, for example aluminium production also later on. Now coming to the article, climate finance taxonomy serves as a tool to identify the activities which are consistent with India's climate action goals. The objective will be to encourage investment further in the climate friendly technologies to ensure that India is able to achieve its net zero target by 2070. This taxonomy will be preventing the greenwashing and consistent with our goal of Viksit Bharat. So this document aims to classify a range of activities and sectors also as the climate supportive or climate transition. The climate supportive activities include the activities which reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, reduce the emissions intensity, adaptation solutions that reduce the risk of adverse impact of climate change, and research and development in this regard. Whereas climate supportive activities would include those that improve the emissions intensity reduction in the sectors where cutting absolute emissions are challenges with the available technology. Now, the next article is related to child labor. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics. As per the International Labour Organization, child labor means any work that deprives the children of their childhood, their potential, their dignity, and is harmful to their physical and mental development. As per ILO, there are 10 million working children in India. What are the sectors which employ child labor in India? They include brick kilns, carpet weaving, garment making, domestic service, unorganized sectors, for example tea stalls, agriculture. And as per the Sustainable Development Goal 8, we need to eradicate child labor in all forms. But what are the reasons behind child labor? The foremost and primary reason is poverty, then debt trap, human trafficking, cutting costs at factories, greed, socio-economic factors, lack of access to education, and inadequate social protection that is provided from the government side. Now regarding the protection of children from engaging in child labor, there are constitutional provisions. For example, every child from the age of 6 to 14 years has the right to access free and compulsory education as per Article 21A. There is a prohibition of trafficking and employment in forced labor as per Article 23. As per Article 24, there has to be a prohibition upon the employment of child labor. As per Article 39, it is the directive principle. It imposes a duty upon the state to ensure that the tender age of children is not exploited where they are forced out of economic necessity to engage in the avocations which are unsuited to their age or strength. Article 45 seeks to provide the early childhood care and education for children. There are certain statutes also in India targeting child labor. For example, under the Factories Act 1948, the children less than the age of 14 years are prohibited from employment in factories. Under the Mines Act 1952, the children less than the age of 18 years are prohibited from working in mines. Likewise, the children from the age of 6 to 14 years are guaranteed the free and compulsory education under the Right to Education Act 2009. Under the Child Labour Prohibition and Regulation Amendment Act 2016, no child less than the age of 14 years shall be employed, and the children from 14 to 18 years of age shall not be employed in hazardous occupations. Now coming to the article, there is the employment of children in the dangerous industries, in the hazardous industries also. And the chances of the employment of children from the disadvantaged religious or caste backgrounds and also from impoverished backgrounds is more likely. And they are subjected to abuse, both physical and verbal abuse. They are given low wages and they have a lack of access to the health services even as they suffer accidents or injuries. The lack of proper hygiene, sanitation and clean water leads to children becoming easily susceptible to infectious diseases. Working with toxic materials causes long-lasting symptoms, sometimes illnesses. The sectors that require urgent attention include the production of matches, fireworks, glass, leather products, etc. Now, the next article is related to predatory pricing. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss two concepts, predatory pricing and limit pricing. Predatory pricing is the concept of setting the prices of any goods or services so low that it drives the competition out of the market. They are usually set below the cost of production, below the cost of providing that service itself, to ensure that there are no competitors left. Therefore, they are provided for a temporary time only, not for the long run, until only the time when the competitors are driven out. It involves a huge financial risk also, because in the short run there will be losses. But for the consumers there can be short-term benefits from the lower prices. But in the long terms, consumers will not be benefiting, they will be rather on the losing side because there will be reduced competition, and hence it is considered illegal and anti-competitive. It is usually more effective in those markets which have high entry barriers, for example telecom sector. When we look at the limit pricing, it means that the prices are set low enough to discourage the new entrants, but they are not necessarily below the cost of providing that service or the cost of that good. It is to prevent the potential competitors from entering the market, not for driving the existing competitors out of the market. Therefore, limit pricing can be sustained over a longer period to deter the new entrants, and it has a lower financial risk. The consumers, they usually benefit from the persistent low prices, but it can be legal as compared to the predatory pricing, which will be illegal as it is anti-competitive, and it is more effective in those markets where there are moderate barriers to entry. Now coming to the article, the Competition Commission of India has notified new definitions for the various costs that it will use to judge whether the pricing is predatory or not. According to the Competition Act 2002, predatory pricing is where a product or service is priced below its cost, which is to be determined through regulations, just like the regulation which the Competition Commission of India has issued with the aim to reduce competition and eliminate competitors. So according to this notification, the cost of a good or service would be assumed to be its average variable cost, which is the total variable cost divided by the total output during a particular period. Here the total variable cost reflects the total cost including everything that goes into the production of the goods or service minus the fixed cost and the fixed overheads which are attributable to the product. Now let's also have a look at the Competition Commission of India, since it is the body that came up with the latest notification. It's a statutory body formed under the Competition Act 2002. The goal of Competition Commission of India is to ensure a level playing field for all the producers, the companies, and also to ensure the welfare of the consumers. So what does it do? It eliminates the practices which are having adverse effects on the competition. Therefore, it ensures the freedom of trade in the markets. What is its mandate? It seeks to implement the Competition Act 2002, and the Competition Act prohibits the anti-competitive agreements and abuse of the dominant position by the enterprises. It regulates the mergers and acquisitions of the companies also, which can have an adverse effect on the competition. Therefore, mergers above a certain threshold have to be approved first by the Competition Commission of India. And the composition of the CCI is 1 chairperson and 6 additional members, and all the members are appointed by the central government. The headquarters of the Competition Commission of India is located in New Delhi. Now the next article is related to the academic freedom. This is important in GS2 under the topic issues relating to education. What is academic freedom essentially? What are the principles guiding it? Academic freedom means there should be a right to teach, right to learn without external interference, without too much interference, whether it is coming from the political actors or from the religious actors. Therefore, it includes the freedom of research, freedom of instruction as well as publication, and it must follow the scholarly norms. For example, the teaching must be evidence-based teaching rather than the spreading of propaganda or the spreading of rhetorics. As per UNESCO, it means pursuit of knowledge wherever truth may lead. As per the Humboldtian model, it unites research and teaching in free inquiry, that is ensuring academic freedom. When you look at the historical context, it was curbed. In medieval Europe, there was the church-controlled education. There was the persecution of dissent also. Dissenters were punished in medieval Europe. In Soviet Union in 1930s, there was a ban on certain streams. For example, the banning of bourgeois pseudoscience. For example, the banning of the reading of sociology and genetics in Soviet Union. In the ancient times in Nalanda and Taxila, the academic freedom flourished. It flourished under the royal patronage and open exchange of information and scholarly knowledge. But there are certain modern challenges regarding academic freedom. If you observe, there are political and institutional pressures. For example, the differing stances of universities like Columbia versus Harvard. There is the funding agencies which influence the research priorities. The funds are provided only if research is in particular sectors. And the university rankings are prioritized if their publications are regarding the intellectual freedom. And there is the upcoming publish or perish culture as well, which is observed. Peter Higgs, that's an example quoted in the newspaper article itself, almost lost his job due to low output before he went on to win the Nobel Prize. The peer pressure also stifles the long-term unconventional research as well, that curbs the academic freedom. When we look at the global picture regarding the academic freedom, in democracies it is usually upheld. The judiciary and the elections of the legislators in democracies, it ensures that there are checks upon the interference on the academic freedom. But when we look at the autocracies, usually the academic freedom is restricted and the undesirable fields, they are not allowed to be studied, they are restricted in the autocracies. For example, in the Soviet Union itself, the sociology and genetics study was restricted earlier. And in the ancient times, there was dependence upon the patronages also. For example, the ancient universities, they relied on the rulers' support. The next article is related to the Nipah virus. This is important in GS2 under the topic health. The Nipah virus is a zoonotic illness that it is transmitted via animals to the humans. The organism which causes Nipah virus is the RNA virus, the ribonucleic acid virus of the family Paramyxoviridae, and it is of the genus Henipavirus, and it is closely related to the Hendra virus. It first appeared in the domestic pigs, then subsequently it appeared in dogs, cats, goats, horses, and even sheep. It was first identified in 1998 during an outbreak in Malaysia. The fruit bats are the natural hosts of the Nipah virus. And the fruit bats cause transmission of the Nipah virus to humans, which may occur after direct contact with the infected bats or with pigs also, by consuming the fruits eaten by the infected bats and birds, and it can then spread to the other people through contact with the other Nipah virus infected people. And therefore it is present in the bat urine and potentially in bat feces, saliva, as well as the birthing fluids. The symptoms of Nipah virus include encephalitic syndrome, which is marked by fever, headache, drowsiness, disorientation, mental confusion, coma, and even potentially death. Thank you.